specific benefit doesn't happen, you can envision in similar scenarios that there'd be other benefits that could really happen. And likewise, if you say, oh, that's not a real risk, there's going to be some other risk in the real scenario, and that's what we want to focus on, is how are we going to deal with these in the real world. The other issue is this touches upon medical information. We are not opening a discussion on the merits or the applicability or how to apply HIPAA. Again, this is just a scenario to get out the larger issues. Being a professor this week, I know you didn't do your homework. So the scenario is we have a application and device. We are not picking on Time Warner Cable. It is called Roadrunner, and I also want to thank Joe for giving us the scenario. It comes from the Future Privacy Forum. So this act collects and analyzes information about your diet, your health, your exercise, whether you're getting sleep and all that. And then it does a lot of data analysis. So you got a bit of Internet of Things because there's a lot of them out there. And in fact, later on in the panel, we hope to get into even deeper on the issues about the Internet of Things. But it's also dealing with people. But oh, by the way, it's a successful app. Lots of people are using it. It gets lots of statistics. It reminds people to take their medicine. Oh, by the way, you can also have it configured that if it's time to take your medicine or something wrong's going on, it'll call your mom, let them know that you got a problem. The company keeps your data forever, but it's de-identified. And part of the reasons for that is the company is figuring that with all of this data, it might be able to prevent epidemics, cure lethal diseases, and increase life expectancy by up to 40 years. Again, we're not going to debate whether it will really do that, but you can envision how such devices could do that. As well, the company is allowing this data out to qualified researchers, and in fact, they've already discovered a drug interaction, a sequelae, where particular users using a particular drug, doing a particular exercise regimen, get sick. And from that, they've already been able to save lots and lots of lives and change the labeling on the device. They've created a community index, how different people in different communities are doing well. There's some downsides to that because insurance companies are saying, wow, you live in a healthy community, we'll lower your rates. Or you live in a not so healthy community, we'll raise your rates. You can again imagine how you could de-identify the information, but the belief is it would be too expensive to de-identify the information. So with that scenario, I will very, very quickly introduce the panel. First, David Sneed from the I2 Internet Infrastructure Coalition. Got Joe Jerome from the Future Privacy Forum, Dan Caprio from McKenna Lawn and Aldridge, then Heather West from Google, and Ruth Yodakin from the Federal Trade Commission, and she does have a caveat for us.
I'm not speaking for the commission or any particular commissioners. My remarks today are my own. Thank you.
Especially since we have real lawyers on the panel. So with that, and again, the idea here, because the panelists obviously have things to say, that's why they're on the panel, but you're not here and they're not here for them to just lecture for you. The idea is, as the multi-stakeholder group, as everybody, we come up with more information and more ideas and more suggestions to feed into the global IGF process than just what we have here to say. So I'll kick it off with a question or two, but I'm expecting to make the guy with the microphone do a lot of running around capturing people. But the first one that I will open it up for the panel is, historically the US has relied on notice and consent to use data. So should organizations, especially when you have this Internet of Things, lots and lots of devices, lots and lots of people, should we move from rigid notice and choice mechanisms to better communicate how data is being used? And if we are going to do that, how would we do that? So who wants to, go right ahead, youth.
Of course, I'm not going to advocate a position for the group, but you know, the FTC has traditionally looked at notice as the foundation of the agreement when you have data that's being collected and shared. And this notice is really just laying out things for the consumer to say, this is our bargain. We are going to give you some product, give you some service, and we're going to either take some money from you, or maybe we're just going to do it for free, but in exchange, we're going to use some of your data. And so it seems the fundamental thing to really put that out there in a way that's useful. I think what has happened is that technology has evolved, analytics have evolved, and we really have this, you know, these amazing leaps in the area of how we're using data. But we haven't made a lot of leaps in how companies are conveying that information to consumers. So I don't think it has to be a rigid kind of structure for how companies tell consumers about that. We have seen some amazing changes. One area is in the area of mobile, where there's really been an effort to notify consumers, you know, at the moment it happens, some business wants to use your location data or something like that. And so I think really it's not necessarily changing the structure, but it's having some sort of evolution in the way this is done.
I agree with Ruth. I don't see it as an either or. I mean, as Ruth said, you know, the fair information practice principles really are based on notice and choice, and the challenge really in the 21st century is, and the White House Big Data Report alludes to this, but is how do we kind of adapt and pay homage to the FIPS and notice and choice, but how do we start thinking about the use cases and sort of real world harms and consequences, and can the use of data help to inform, you know, some of the potential gaps? I guess it's important to stipulate we collect a lot of data. We're not going to put that genie, you know, back in the bottle. So I think the real challenge, you know, for our panel and for IGF, and as we think about big data and the Internet of Things, is how do we work, I mean, in the multi-stakeholder process among civil society, regulators, industry, and academics, to begin to think about those use cases and sort of allow the market to develop. And the other thing to sort of drill down on that just a little bit, it's, you know, the context is still important. You don't want to surprise a consumer, but the other part is how do we create, you know, an accountable privacy policy, and what does accountability really mean? Because part of the challenge that we have with notice and choice is it puts the responsibility on the individual, and I think we've got to get away from that and sort of put the burden really more on, you know, on the holder of the data, and really begin to do some significant work on what accountability and transparency might look like.
So, I'll add from the infrastructure perspective, and I want to push back a little bit on the principles of notice and choice and those kind of traditional ways of framing these privacy and security debates, because they tend to break down a little bit when you talk about the way the internet is actually run. So I use the description of I2 Coalition's traditional members. They're essentially systems integrators, right? So you have people who are 5 leaps down the chain, who are handling data and processing data, and these concepts of auditing and notice and choice and the ability to change information really begin to break down. And so what I would challenge the audience to think about are ways that we can broaden this discussion so that the opportunities that consumers have and the opportunities that the people who are processing big data have are broader than this kind of narrow scope. So that's my point.
So I guess I'll jump in. First things first, apologies for giving everybody a reading assignment. The whole idea behind what we were doing is we've been having conversations at the Future of Privacy Forum about how we should think about big data. And basically the hypothetical, I think, does a really good job of showing how any sort of rigid application of notice and choice doesn't really work in big data. I mean, just reading it, the way notice and choice works today is you get these long privacy policies, and I'm not sure how a long privacy policy would have informed you of all the things this app could have done or done it in any sort of meaningful way. I guess the whole point of the hypothetical is to show how notice and choice is strained. Hopefully we're not going to start arguing around here, but I think everybody's going to sort of second this notion that we shouldn't sort of throw away notice and choice, but we need to instead sort of approach it from a more flexible manner. That said, I'd like to sort of discuss or think forward about what that sort of flexibility looks like. The calls for flexibility aren't really anything new. I wanted to sort of highlight the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights, which I think has a lot of really interesting ideas and ways for us to think forward on big data and the Internet of Things. And the word flexibility is bandied about all over the place. And we've already sort of had some of the privacy buzzwords show up in the conversation, use-based approaches to things and context. And those are things that are mentioned at length in the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights and the White House Big Data Report. I think what we need to do moving forward and what multi-stakeholder or whatever sort of convenings you want to have moving forward, we need to start figuring out what exactly we mean by those things. They're great terms, they're great ways to frame the debate, but I think they could be also really helpful in helping notice and choice have more flexibility in the age of big data.
Yeah, I think that it's really interesting to watch. I know that we've been kind of experimenting with additional notices and kind of making sure that we have the most clear notice that we can come up with so that our users really understand what's going on. And kind of making sure that it's contextual. I think it's a lot more useful to have a learn more link at the top of Gmail, to explain some particular feature than it is to kind of throw all of this information at someone's during the sign-up process. I think that that's the kind of thing that when we take a look at it and kind of do some research, do some user studies, what are we going to be able to do so that our users understand and are comfortable with what's going on and understand their choices. And that's going to, I think, take a little bit more research. I was thrilled that the White House Big Data Report kind of talked about this and said, maybe we need a slightly, to think about how we're doing this. So it's a great conversation to have.
I would just add to what Heather said. This is hard. This is going to be hard. I mean, we've had the traditional fair information practices and the FIPS and notice and choice that go back to the 70s. And it was with centralized databases and structured data sets, and we don't live in that world anymore. But I think part of what's important about our discussion today is this is a perfect topic really for IGF and the multi-stakeholder process, because we need the folks that live in privacy and security. We need the engineers. We need the technologists. We need the people that are expert in standard setting. And sort of understanding each other's language, because when it comes to big data and the Internet of Things, we're talking about some technology and some solutions that are really transformative and really have the ability to solve some of the world's big problems. And so we can't just do it from the U.S. We can't just do it from Europe. But I mean, we need your help. And so. And we can talk more about what we're doing in IGF, but I mean, I think IGF is a perfect example of how a multi-stakeholder process can work, because we're seeing all the potential applications and the societal benefits, but we've got to catch up in sort of the public policy sense to make sure that, we have big data and Internet of Things as opposed to the Internet of far fewer things.
So I don't see hands up yet. Oh, Jim, where's our mic runner? There you go. Yeah, sorry, we're getting you guys involved a lot earlier. While you're running, there's someone closer here if you got one too. Or we only have one. Well, keep going.
You got two.
So, thank you.
Who are you,
Eric.
Jim?
Eric.
I'm sorry, and my fault for not saying you. Even though you are encouraged to make comments in this group, you still have to say who you are and if you're representing someone who you're representing.
Oh, I'm not allowed to be anonymous?
No. Sorry, no anonymity in this net.
So I'm Eric Berger, and I'm here to help.
Thanks, Jim.
No, so I'm James Galvin. And the question that I have about the big data is the problem that I have with the discussion about notice and consent or choice, however you care to characterize it, is I think it puts the wrong perspective on it. And I'd like to suggest a different perspective on how one looks at big data and privacy and trust in particular. For me, it's really about ownership and sharing. The problem with notice and consent or choice is that it's always from one perspective or another. Who's the winner in that kind of situation? All right, somebody's collecting the data. So you're sort of approaching it from the point of view of, I'm the service provider who's collecting data. I'm simply going to tell you what I'm doing, and you're kind of stuck with it. Okay? I mean, you can choose to not do business with me. Well, that might or might not work. In some cases, I don't have any choices, or maybe I do. But even if I do have a choice and I'm with you now, what really happens is you go bankrupt or you otherwise sell out and somebody else acquires you. And now what happens to those terms of service? And service providers, anyway, in general, change their terms of service. Pretty much it will. So there's no stability in terms of what that notice and consent ultimately becomes. I think that you want to put, if you change the question to be talking about ownership and sharing, then you look at it from the perspective of the data is about me. So I should have part ownership of the data. Okay? And anything that you decide to do with the data should require that I actively acknowledge that that's allowed. And that's not transferable. Even if you move the data to someone else because you get bought out and your service moves, okay, if you want to change your terms of service, then it involves me. I'm a part of that. I'm essentially becoming a shareholder in what you're doing. So the idea that I own all the data about me and you have to acknowledge that and you have to deal with that is kind of interesting. And then you take it the question of sharing. It's like, okay, whatever I want to do with that data, I should have to get your approval because you're part owner, and therefore you have a say about your data. And so it's not really entirely a consensus kind of model. One could argue that should be absolute. And the reason why I suggest that is because if you look at privacy, right, the fundamental problem you have with privacy is you really don't have any recourse, right? There's no redress. If you lose your privacy, it's gone. So it should also be the case that it's onerous on you to have to support my privacy and acknowledge it and make sure that I never lose it. And that's why I suggest the model of talking about ownership and sharing.
I guess Dan and then Ruth, do you have something to say?
Yeah,
on this
sure.
too?
I wanted to jump in on a couple of things. I know this is a broad discussion, so we're gonna go through a number of areas. Let me just say first on the material change, at least under U.S. law, if somebody has collected your data and they're going to make a material change, then they have to get your consent for that. If you have made the deal with them, that you are working with them, that you are doing business with them, then they can't just change the terms in a significant way. Another thing is, and we have tried to step in cases where we have seen, Borders is one of them, we have seen where a company has collected data and then the company is going out of business or selling its assets, and a company has to live up to its promises, at least under U.S. law right now. We do not have that, obviously, we don't have that approach to you own all your data, but I will take issue with Dan's comment that the collection genie is out of the bag. Because I think really right now, with the Internet of Things evolving, what we're seeing is a huge expansion in collection. And I think this is a perfect time to really, if there is a perfect time, but this is a good time to still really focus on that original collection.
Dan, did you have, or someone else?
Sure. I mean, to your point, I mean, I think the scenario that you're describing is really more of a European perspective, where privacy is seen as a fundamental human right. I mean, we value privacy in the U.S. and have the Fourth Amendment and other things against surveillance and unreasonable search and seizure. But to go back to the point about notice and collection, we're not starting with a blank piece of paper. And so there's just huge, as much as notice and consent is difficult, in the age of big data and the Internet of Things, there is kind of a global consensus about it. And so what I'm advocating is, it needs to be adapted and be made, a little more flexible and kind of interoperable. But we do have to recognize that, and especially in the context of IGF, we have lots of, privacy is evolving, and it's also, and it's it has cultural norms. It's harder than security in a way because it's not, it's subjective. It's kind of in the eyes of the beholder. But it's something that when we talk about notice and choice, I think that our challenge is how do we evolve it and adapt it.
Joe?
So I liked everything that you said, although the lawyer in me immediately sort of gets squeamish when you talk about data ownership. I mean, how do you slice that bread? I don't want to start throwing out terms, but then how does that apply to sort of de-identified or anonymized or aggregated data? I don't know how you answer that question. I think that becomes really challenging. That said, I think that model, or at least the discussion you're framing, really does sort of suggest that companies need to find ways to give consumers and individuals more bang for their buck or value for their data. I think the first company that finds a business model that can do that in a really efficient and effective way is going to make a ton of money, because I think the past year has shown that people are becoming more and more aware of how much of their data is out there and what big data is as a term, and they want to have some sort of control over it, and that's going to be challenging to implement. But if you can replace that with giving them value, I think that's a huge first step and a positive first step.
Yeah. No, and I think it's obviously a complicated discussion. I think that when we're creating tools, we think of this all as a shared responsibility. It's we need to be thoughtful about what we're doing. We need to be thoughtful about the tools that we provide, and we hope that our users are thoughtful about learning about those tools and managing their data. And usually it's their data. We have certain business records we have to keep, but otherwise things like Gmail or photos or that kind of thing, yeah, that's their data. And there's some context. I think especially in the case of this case study, that's user data. There's really interesting stuff there that this service can analyze for that user, but that's their data, and it is sensitive data. And I will say I am a giant Fitbit nut, so this is a perfect scenario. And I just noticed that Dan has one too. This is something that people really look at and see the value, and I think that then people can be thoughtful because they see, oh, so that's what's going on, and it becomes more of a it's not really more of a learning process and thoughtful, and I think that that's what needs to happen from all perspectives.
Did I see someone over here? I did see someone over here.
Hi, my name is David Viorst. I'm with ISOC DC. I want to commend you guys on choosing such a great scenario that illustrates so many of the real practical concerns people have. In this scenario, the Acme company is selling medical data or recycling medical data, but scrubbing it of scrubbing the personal identifiers from it, right? It says that it's led insurance companies to kind of redline people or adjust rates. So people could get redlined based on this aggregated data. Two questions from that. And it also says that although the data's been de-identified, personal PII, personally identifiable information, could be easily ascertained or figured out, especially with today's technologies. So does the insurance redlining raise any regulatory concerns? And is there a problem? I mean, do we need protections against algorithms that might be able to identify people's personal information from this aggregated data? I'd like a few panelists to answer that.
Okay, I'm happy to jump in. I've been part of it. And I'm sure we can all talk about it, and I'm sure that there are many of you out in the audience who have an opinion and have some things to add, so I'm looking forward to hearing some of that. In terms of the legal issues, there may be some legal issues. There are some use-related data laws in the United States, and one of them is the Fair Credit Reporting Act. The Fair Credit Reporting Act was put together in the 70s, and did not envision an ecosystem like this. And I think we have this issue with a lot of laws around data, where it did not really envision a world where inferences are being made by parties that are not consumer reporting agencies, and they're passing it on to other entities. So, you know, this is an area that still needs some exploration. The FTC has done some work. In the case of Spokio was a case where it used the Fair Credit Reporting Act for an online company that was gathering information, but it was marketing that information to be used for employment purposes. In this scenario, it's not really clear if, you know, how this may be marketed. I will put in a little plug for a September 15th workshop at the FTC, which is specifically about big data, and the questions related to this: is it a tool for inclusion or exclusion?
Well, I would add the scenario is a good one, and to Ruth's point, existing law applies. But you can look at this scenario, and you have to look at it very carefully to really question some of the practices of Acme Corporation, in the sense of, again, back to the point of context. I mean, the normal customer, you would, if you had an insulin pump, you would expect, and you would want that information to be shared with your doctor, right? We could all agree with that. But I don't think anybody would expect that then that information was being shared for marketing purposes or for actuarial purposes. And so, it's kind of the old rule of, and again, I'm not even sure that you could do this, but just because you can doesn't mean that you should. So, I mean, we've got to, as we think about this, there's sort of some common sense that has to apply, especially when it comes to, financial, medical, things that the inferences that, would it surprise the average customer? I think most people, would say, hey, if I've got an insulin pump or a heart pump, I mean, they'd want their doctor to know and be able to regulate their condition, but they didn't sign up for marketing purposes. And so that's going to require, a very thoughtful and kind of deliberate discussion among industry and civil society and our regulators.
I just want to jump in for 1 second to say that I wasn't saying that existing law does apply. I'm not sure if existing law would apply, so on that one.
I think there's a lot of lessons that can be drawn from existing laws. Considering the FTC's workshop, we're actually working on a project to try and take lessons from fair lending laws and see how they might apply to fair marketing in general. But I think there's really no question that the laws are antiquated. So at least the Future of Privacy Forum's position is this provides an excellent space for companies and organizations and responsible entities to jump in and, you know, to be a lot more proactive. The buzzword that we like to use is more transparency. I think transparency and openness by companies and organizations would resolve a lot of the questioner's problems. You know, and there's lots of interesting models that are already out there about companies that are trying to have these dialogues with consumers. I sort of hate to bring up the right to be forgotten, but I actually think, but I think Google's process for that is actually really illustrative. Like, they're doing a lot of, I think, really positive things. They're having a collection of experts get together and sort of advise. They're seeking public input. They're being really sort of transparent about how they're going to try and implement this decision. And the right to be forgotten isn't quite a big data issue, but you see that, and that could apply to any number of real, like, legitimate big data questions. You know, something like the you know, the recent Facebook emotional study, or any type of real marketing purpose, or, you know, educational technologies. These are things that people have a lot of sort of concerns about, but that you could probably alleviate a lot of these concerns without having to drag laws into it if organizations were just a lot more open about what they wanted to do.
So I'm glad that you brought up the right to be forgotten, or maybe I'm not glad that you brought up the right to be forgotten. But so the discussion for me, and this might get us a little bit off track, but your point and your point about redlining brings up for me the fact that this discussion seems to be kind of binary. We're talking about notice and choice, or we're talking about consumers and processors of data. But, you know, I do think we need to introduce an element here of a public interest. Might there be some public interest in some of the uses of data that individuals might not agree with? So the term redlining, I know, is a loaded term, but might there be a benefit in the use of the data by insurance companies for in certain circumstances? So I'd like to introduce that in the discussion to talk about some public good and hopefully, you know, introduce that.
So, actually, there is another person, but midterm exam, and especially since we can't see, you've probably heard that over and over again, we're going to do an IETF thing. I'm going to ask for a hum from the audience to get a little more audience participation. I'm going to be asking 4 questions.
I see a couple hands that were up, though. I saw 3 hands up.
You saw 3 hands up?
Yeah, 4.
Okay, well,
Five.
actually, but this person has had his hand up for a while. Go ahead. Well, you're there, you can see. I could only see I know one of those guys were there.
These lights are.
Yeah.
Pablo Molina with Georgetown University, but also on the board of the Electronic Privacy Information Center. We do have fair information practices principles, and we have had a combination of regulation and self-regulation in privacy for quite some time. And it doesn't seem to be working for some of the new technologies that are arriving in the marketplace. They don't work that well with big data. They don't work that well with the Internet of Things. They don't work that well with the new educational systems that are amassing data about all the students from the moment they're born until they die. And I'm even more concerned about how much better can they work and protect our privacy as we move from big data to huge data, as we move from health informatics to everybody carrying a vital sensor, as we move from the Internet of Things to the Internet of Everything. So the question is, what can we do better when it comes to regulation? How can we get companies not to shirk the responsibility and run a social experiment like Facebook? Or how can we get organizations and agencies like the FTC to do better when it comes to protecting the privacy, to be able to prove that there was harm to consumers and hence be able to direct the companies to do the right thing?
Well, I just want to say, I think my immediate gut response to that, and this is challenging and another dialogue we need to have, is that we need to have a big data, I think, requires and necessitates a broader definition of harm. And it can't just be harm in a negative sense. Big data brings up all sorts of really, I think, important and challenging ethical questions that I think society or, you know, organizations need to come to a, you know, a position on before you can actually, you know, start enacting solutions. all over the place, we just have lots of policy issues where we haven't really decided what the ultimate value is. Until we figure out, what we think is good or bad and how that should inform how the FTC or how our regulators should think of privacy harms, I think you're sort of right. We are sort of stuck.
I had some comments, but I don't know if you want to go and hear the other people who have had their hands up first, and then I'm happy to jump in if we're trying to make this
Although
more
actually, I would,
interactive.
since the microphone is still near Pablo, do you have a thought on that? Or you lost the microphone?
Well,
Sorry.
and while you're getting it, I can just tell you that at least in the area of big data or data brokers, let me just put it that way. The FTC just came out with a report recently, and we have the agency has asked once again for Congress to enact legislation that would have some requirements related to data brokers sharing data and notification that would have to be made. It includes a number of recommendations, and I can just tell you some of them. One is that the whole report, which is very interesting exploration of this area of background sharing, and I recommend it to anybody who's interested in this topic. It has some diagrams that are quite nice. But the whole concept is that there are all these companies operating in the background and sharing data. And so what the commission asked for was that there be some regulation from Congress. It's not the first time we've asked for that, but that it, one, find some mechanism for the data brokers who do not interact directly with consumers to identify themselves and have a way for a consumer to get access to the information that is about them. And second, for the businesses that do interact with consumers but are sharing the data down the line to make it clear who they're sharing the data with. And then there are also some other provisions that are specific. One of them is, for example, it's related to use for those companies that are using data that they have gotten about a consumer to make a decision such as whether to enable the consumer to pay for something. Perhaps it's making a decision about whether a consumer is creditworthy at that time when they're trying to purchase something, that if they deny the consumer the ability to do that, that they then tell the consumer where the information came from that they used for making that decision. So there are some recommendations related to that.
And I would just add, I'd like to commend the work that the FTC is doing. I think within big data and the Internet of Things, I mean, the FTC has established itself as the cop on the beat. The TrendNet case, the IP-enabled camera, was a perfect example of a known security flaw that should have been corrected and wasn't. And so that's a positive thing. And then the workshops, the workshop the FTC did on the Internet of Things last November, the workshop the FTC is doing on big data in September. I mean, that's sort of the perfect thing for the commission to be doing, kind of educating itself and raising issues and having encouraging the dialogue between civil society, industry, and regulators.
So we've got some people over here
Lots of hands.
waving their hands.
Lots of
I just see waving hands. The people with the microphones are going to have to choose who is first or who is the loudest.
How you doing? My name is AJ Forsiak. I'm part of a group here today that's part of the National Defense University. We're students, and I'm a member of DoD and part of the Intel community. So the big thing in the Intel community, we have to abide by laws, and we can't collect on U.S. persons. So as we move to cloud, we move to big data. Big thing we're concerned in DoD is with what's called CRUD, which is create, replace, update, and delete. So because if there's information on a U.S. person in there, we have 30 days to purge that from the system. If you take a large global Hadoop cluster that's now hosted on a Google platform in 4 countries, how do you do that?
So are you asking for a technical answer?
all day we were talking about policy, and we were talking about the right to be forgotten. I mean, it was, so we could put a policy in effect that states you have got to, that if it's, I don't want that data in there anymore, you have to purge it. How are you going to, is it something that, I mean, it's also, how is industry going to do it? But I think, the IGF can use their voice so that industry can now think in those terms. I mean, it's just, it's policy is the only way that's going to change. We know the internet grew because of lack of guidelines. We've heard this all today. It's because of all the developers are able to work it and just continue to work it without a lot of policy and self-regulating. So now we're looking at putting more governance in the process. This is the biggest issue you're going to face in big data and personal privacy. If I don't want that in there, how do I get it out of your system? And that's going to be governance, and it's also going to be how they're going to actually do it. Because it's going to be across thousands and thousands of servers on multiple databases. It's just how you can't get it out of there. It's
Sure.
almost impossible to get the data out of there.
So from an infrastructure perspective and from a cloud provider perspective, those issues are difficult to address. So the hypothetical that I use when I'm giving talks on this is, in some cases, a cloud provider might outsource just a tiny bit of their storage, the backups, and they can't control what happens with those backups. That said, I am not convinced, and actually I'm actually very certain that this problem is a political problem and not a technical problem. I don't think that the technical community is beyond figuring out if society decides that, for example, the right to be forgotten is important, that there is a way of accommodating that right technically, that there's a way to accommodate that right across networks. The issue, though, is society willing to bear the costs in terms of how information is stored, how information is processed? That's where I see the big issue, as opposed to a technical issue.
Yeah, I do think at a technical issue, it's possible. It just takes the commitment to maintaining your data and kind of data hygiene. From our perspective, we have a whole team that does that. I can't help with like identifying U.S. persons, but the maintenance of the data is possible.
And while the mic's moving around, I'll do this another shameless self-promotion. So at Georgetown, we do have technologies where the backups can be rendered useless. It's just a matter of money.
So I'm Eric Percival. I'm from DoD as well with the NDU students, and a little bit different perspective. One thing that I think a good analogy or a comparison is, car insurance rates, right? They target zip codes and charge us different rates based on what's happening there. So it's public available data that they can use and manipulate. If I want to tell Progressive, let me plug this in my machine, they'll give me a rate if I'm doing good things, right? So I may, as a consumer, want to opt out and choose to give my data to be used for a purpose, maybe for a free app or for money or whatever. But then there's other data I might not want. So I think what we need is a little bit more granularity, because not all data is created equal, where we can choose to say, for example, generic data that's been scrubbed can go this way, and private data I have to personally say, yes, use it, and then the first time you use it, I have to say it again. Some type of governance that way. But then we also need to add on that some type of algorithm that defines when something becomes identifiable. So, if you take all the data points you're using, if you can, identify, more than 5% of the people, then that cross the line. Something like that would have to be, I think, the way we would go forward to be able to give consumers the choice and to participate in this or not. Now, a few of us might determine, okay, well, I really don't want to, but everybody else does. And so because of this data, we do start having an effect on us because of all the choices they made. And that correction needs to be done by the competitive nature of our capitalism. I think what we'll find is as more and more people are affected that way, then the choices that they're making will be different. So that's all I wanted to say, and get your comment on it.
I mean, I think I'm less familiar with some of the technical de-identification stuff, but I know that there are folks doing work on that, and I know, and I told Eric before this panel that I wouldn't talk HIPAA, but I will do one little HIPAA, because it's really not my area of expertise, but I know that there are a lot of folks looking at how to do that kind of assurance that you can only, you know, re-identification risk is low. So I can't point you at anyone specifically, but the work is out there.
The big problem, at least from my perspective, on de-identification, and yeah, that's something that there needs to be a lot more discussion both on, I think, technical de-identification and also what that means from a practical sense. But I think you said earlier, like, you didn't like that things were binary. De-identification, at least in the world of big data, is something that has become, unfortunately, just sort of this like hard line. And unfortunately, people on both sides of the divide are making it very hard to actually move forward and have a common sense discussion about what we want about de-identification and what identified data really means.
I'm happy to jump in on the de-identification item for a second too. I mean, it is complicated, and you do see a lot of things. I mean, you just recently saw something from our Canadian privacy experts on de-identification. You also saw something coming out of Princeton very recently arguing the opposite. You know, I think one of the big questions with anonymization and de-identification of data is how long it lasts, right? So you have data that was considered anonymous 15 years ago, and now it's basically, you know, the equivalent of a Sudoku puzzle for technical experts, right? Ooh, let's see if we can figure out which combinations would work. At least from the FTC end, what we've recommended, which I think is useful, is that you have to be current with your anonymization or aggregation techniques, your sample size, and so forth. But you also have to have some sort of agreement in there. So it's, you know, in the example we have here that we are I guess, working through, we have this idea that data is handed off because it's anonymized. And at the FTC, we say, well, if you're fine, hand it off, look at it, say it's anonymized, but put an agreement in there that they will not re-identify it. And they will, if they're sharing it, they've got to have that same agreement in there. And there are a lot of companies, I think, that are taking that approach.
Hi, Dan O'Connor, Director of Public Policy at the Computer Communications Industry Association. It's been a great panel so far and great answers, and I kind of wanted to ask you guys a question about the flip side of the privacy coin, if you will. And like privacy and the notions of privacy get a lot of attention, but at least as a consumer, and we've done polling at our association and looked into this, is that security is just as important, and consumers face it every day, as opposed to actual conscious decisions by companies about privacy. So, for example, I'm far more scared as a consumer about like a Target situation or a Wyndham situation, where maybe the company has great, ideals about how to de-identify data or, hold your data or use your data, but they leave an unsecured Wi-Fi router in the middle of their thing, and now all your data is in the hands of a bad actor. So the FTC's had the Wyndham case recently winding through the courts, and I was curious about your thoughts on maybe negligence as far as storing data or best practices on the security side, and just wanted to kind of hear thoughts on that side of the angle as well.
Well, obviously I can't comment on Wyndham, which is ongoing legislation, but yes, I think many people will agree there is no privacy without security. I think, from the, U.S. government perspective, we have, the FTC has power under just its general power for unfair and deceptive practices. There are some specific powers that are related to specific data, such as financial or so forth. Others approach it differently. So we don't use a negligence standard. We have a different standard called unfairness, which has a number of elements.
No, it's obviously a really key aspect of keeping someone's information private. You know, we consider it, you know, strongly our responsibility to secure user data. I think that there's also kind of a user education piece. I think that there's room for a dialogue on the right way to secure data. I think that there's a lot of, you know, Google, we have the benefit of this amazing security team, and I think that there's a lot that others could learn from you know, a discussion about security and a discussion about, you know, how to appropriately protect your data. You know, there's data that really needs a huge amount of world-class security, and then there's, you know, there's going to be data that's less identifiable, less interesting. That's, you know, those companies, maybe Angry Birds scores, for example, don't need Google level security. But yes, obviously very important.
So I like the discussion about, or the comment about a discussion about security, and particularly that there's no one size fits all. And that issue is one of the reasons I really dislike security legislation at a very granular level. One of the major reasons is because it deprives businesses of the ability to create new economic models and new businesses around differentiated levels of security. And it also deprives consumers of the ability to choose differing levels of security based on their needs and based on their price point. So I really do appreciate your comment on that.
Yeah, well, I would offer, though, I get to jump in. Actually, hum time, do we all agree that the people keeping track of Angry Bird scores do not need the level of security that Google does? If you agree, give us a hum. Okay, so you do realize that with the, yeah, I noticed Sean didn't hum. All right, yeah, I'll do the other one. Who doesn't agree? Okay, so the people, with the Angry Bird scores, they know where you are all the time because they're tied into your phone. They know how long you're playing Angry Birds during the day. They know when you're playing Angry Birds, like you're here supposedly working on this, but you're really playing Angry Birds.
I'm going to add one in there. They've probably done some analysis, and they've decided that because you're playing Angry Birds more on Tuesdays, you're more likely to buy their product on Wednesdays.
Right,
There
so
we go.
does Angry Birds need to have any security stuff? It's- Right. So, and I think that's highlighting the Internet of Things and the big data is, as was mentioned, a lot of these laws, a lot of our policies were developed in a time of a company with a database doing a thing. In the world of big data, the whole point is that you're using this disparate sets of data for things you didn't expect to use, like a game score to figure out what you're going to buy, or even better yet, we also know that on Thursday, you're going to go get drunk. And that has issues with, public health and things like that. Is it good? Is it bad? You've already gone, Jim, and I know there were some others. Okay, over here. Yeah.
Hi, Jonathan Zook from ACT, the App Association, and one of the organizers of this panel, and I want to thank all of you, and I think you're doing a great job. I really want to go back to something that David Sneed mentioned earlier, though, which is, and part of the reason that went with this scenario-based approach is to look at all of these detailed topics about data anonymization, regulation that should occur, et cetera, security requirements in the context of the potential that big data holds. And I think it's pretty important to look at, as you mentioned, Professor Berger, this issue about public health related issues. There's issues of potential for big data to come up with big solutions to rising healthcare costs, to energy issues, et cetera. These are enormous public interest issues, and I think that if we compare these episodic issues associated with individual privacy against people sending us ads, we're going to continue to focus the conversation on drilling into the details of how we might better regulate the use of data. And I would love to pull the conversation back to a values conversation and get a conversation started about if you are given the choice between those downsides. Let's say we fail at adequately allowing people to hide their health information from their insurer, for example, against the ability to actually bring down, in some very large measure, the overall cost of healthcare in this country, what decision do we make then, right? And I would love to take this conversation up a level and look at the worst case scenario in terms of personal data management and security, and compare it to the best case scenario of the use of that data, and wonder what kind of a conversation we have at that point purely from a value standpoint.
So let me start with this. So this hypothetical actually is part of a project that the Future of Privacy Forum is working on. It's sort of our contention that we're actually really, industry and organizations are really actually pretty good at evaluating risk. I mean, privacy impact assessments aren't a new thing. It's our proposition sort of moving forward that we do need to actually have a values discussion or a benefit discussion. You're talking about a lot of the benefits of big data, but a lot of that is still sort of hypothetical, or you're sort of putting this out there as it's going to do a lot of these great things. We'd like to see organizations actually sort of implement some sort of formal benefit analysis of projects. So obviously any project an entity does is for the benefit of the organization or for their bottom line. But we'd like to sort of see them walk through exactly what the benefit is, who it's going to help, look at it from the social value of the benefit, and then sort of figure out how likely it is that that benefit or that value can actually be achieved, and to actually begin weighing that sort of substantively against the privacy risks they do. And that sort of by doing that together, you sort of at least, I mean, it certainly does not solve all the problems or issues or concerns, but it at least sort of puts sort of a consideration or a process in place that suggests that companies are doing more. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think there's a huge space for organizations to do much more sort of analysis of what the benefit of their projects are.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in unless time is better spent.
Well, Adi Ascari. I'm a visiting scholar at George Washington University. I find this whole discussion very fascinating, and I like the fact that you made a scenario because it makes it more concrete in a certain way. So one of the issues that pops up often in the privacy discussion is the basics of being transparent, companies being transparent, and users being given choice. But I often wonder, actually, are we often not faced with or given false dichotomies? So are these choices real choices often or not? So in the example of this example given here, this scenario, at the end point where a normal, basically, user living in a low health zip code, does that user actually anymore have a choice of not giving up his information or not? Because at the start, when this app wasn't out yet, you could gain value by opting into the app. But suddenly at the end, you're at a point where if you don't opt in, you're losing value automatically or by default. And also, the choices given to the user are fully giving his information to the insurance company or not at all. Whereas maybe the user could be given, or maybe the user should have an option of, I would want some indication given to the insurance company of what my level of health is without all of my details being given to them. And I see this, I mean, I'm bringing this as a question, but this is more generically, I think often privacy policies presented to us by companies like Google, Facebook, etc., often all of them are providing us with an all or nothing choice of opting in, and often it's obviously very clear we want to use these services because they provide lots of great uses to us, but also I often think maybe, and that's why I think maybe if a value-based approach or if a rights-based approach is used, maybe there could be some kind of limits on these choices that are given to us.
I mean, I think there are a lot of choices that are given to users that some people engage with and some people don't. I think that's. I'm not sure. It doesn't sound like you're advocating for fewer choices. I think you're talking about like guidelines about what choices make sense or are effective.
No, I think sometimes we're giving false choices. So, because I think there is a lot of psychological research on behavioral economics, how you can gently nudge users to make certain choices, etc. So legally, companies are providing choices and users are choosing to opt in for the value. But in reality, if you think a little bit about it, there is actually not much choice that the user can make. It's like everybody's kind of being forced to give up all their data anyway.
I kind of disagree with the premise as Google. But, you know, from my perspective, I think that the biggest problem isn't that, you know, we're trying to manipulate our users, obviously. I think that it's, you know, it's our job to explain the value proposition. And it, you know, in our case, the choices really do impact the products and what we do with them. We think that's really important because everyone's going to think a little bit differently about privacy, and everyone's going to be comfortable with you know, one use but maybe not another. So.
I think also, you know, there's not, we're kind of, you know, as we talk about these things in an abstract way, we start to kind of do them in a black and white thing. I know there's been a lot written and a lot of discussion around this concept of unraveling of privacy, because you're basically, if you're the only person on the block who hasn't, you know, signed up for X, then you're in this position, and in this scenario, you're in the position of having to go prove, you know, that you have a certain level of health or something like that. I think, I know at the FTC we do look, when we look at companies, we do give some thought to companies that are in a position and where there's not a lot of choice for the consumer. I think in a lot of areas, sectors in particular where folks are looking at privacy, and I think in particular of you know, energy, where there's a lot of discussion about energy privacy, there is also emphasis on that. How much of a choice is there? And just to get to another comment that was made earlier, I think also when we think about privacy versus benefits, that this gentleman was speaking about, I mean, I don't see them as, you know, economic benefits and privacy. I don't see them as two things that are opposed to each other. I mean, you can have discussions about whether something is very burdensome for a company to do to make the data as private as it could be, or as its consumers want it to be. But I think, you know, there's general agreement that there is so much promise in the new technologies and in the ability to perform analytics on data. And if we go back to my little example about the Angry Birds app saying that I'm more likely to buy something on Tuesdays, well, maybe that's great for me that all my you know, ads are coming to me on Tuesday, because the rest of the week I just can't deal with this stuff.
So we've got, actually, he's near but far away, Emil Volchek, and if you see Allison running back and forth, she's coming from the Twittersphere for us. What is the impact on, in fact, I'm going to change this a little bit. So it's, what is the impact on privacy? But actually, I'd like to say, you know, what is the relationship and issues, sort of with the Internet of Things? You know, everything in your household, all your household appliances, your lights, all that are connected to the internet. And I want to put this, you know, thank you, Emil, and you can flame at me in the Twitter chat room for changing your question here. Since we're here at the IGF, not just, you know, what are your opinions on privacy, but really, what can the IGF, what can we here who are from technical community, legal community, regulatory community, people, user community, what can we say about that? And I'll actually open up to the panel first.
Well, I'd like to do just a quick level set on what the Internet of Things is. I mean, there is the impression that what we're talking about here is that every known device, you know, on the planet is going to connect to the internet. You know, we've all read the Cisco reports where the projection is that there'll be, you know, 50 billion devices connected to the internet by 2020, or, you know, 2020, and something like 10 or 11 billion now. So you get the exponential growth. But it's really important to kind of think there's just to drill down on, there's sort of three parts to it. There's, you know, sensors that will interact with each other. The second, and I think this is probably, I mean, it's hard to predict business models, but, you know, what we're talking about is devices that will communicate with local area networks, right? Say your thermostat, or your lighting, or your music, or, you know, all the things that we're starting to see some cool applications there. And then, of course, there's the third element, where devices will connect to the internet itself. But we have to kind of keep that in mind so that we don't, the hypothetical that every Coke can is going to be connected to the internet. There's just not a business case for that, and in practice, that's not the way it's going to work.
Although they all might have an RFID chip in them.
I mean, I think that, facilitating discussion amongst, that set of diverse stakeholders is a perfect first step. I think that, there's a lot of discussions in DC that leave out the technical end. There's a lot of technical discussions that leave out the policy end. But we need, all of those stakeholders in the room to think about this kind of thoroughly.
So, I mean, I just have a question for everybody out there. I don't know how you're going to, the Internet of Things, the challenge I see is I don't know how you're going to align sort of product development timelines. So some of the stuff we work on is connected cars, and app development is so much faster than the amount of time it is that cars are actually developed and put into manufacture. And you're going to see the same thing with the refrigerators that know everything. Technology is going to advance really rapidly, but people don't buy refrigerators to last a month. They buy refrigerators to last a decade. And I think that figuring out how we're going to deal with these sort of data management from either a privacy perspective or a security perspective over a longer time frame while also trying to innovate is incredibly hard. So I don't know if anybody has any answers, but I think that's the big question.
Okay, I think we got time for one more, and you guys get to fight over which side it's on.
Okay, Brett Berlin from George Mason University, and actually it turns out, Eric, you're rephrasing the question, and then the discussion that happened is the perfect lead-in to where I think we may want to take a look at what the panel is really, where we want to put the endpoint. We've all heard the metaphor of the problem of putting new wine in old wineskins. And when we do policy, it tends to be very much anchored in the existential and the present, or the immediate present, the problems we're trying to solve now. And we are hampered because, of course, the laws aren't catching up and things like that. But it seems to me, as we address this issue of the Internet of Things, there's a challenge. The challenge is ubiquity. It's a whole different world. You were just describing, Dan, the various modalities of that. Then the question of how are we going to even do this? It's going to change business models and everything. But it's ubiquity, where it could be that the purpose of Internet governance is to figure out how it's going to self-govern in the future, because there may not even be an Internet in the future. It may just be ubiquity. So if we deal with that, we may want to think more strategically. And the question there is, how do we put old wine in new wineskins? And so I just want to suggest a challenging way of thinking about this, because, for example, today, you've regulated credit bureaus for years and things like that, but they're taking, so they have these sets of laws, but then that without almost any regulation, they have new powers, because as this data comes in, suddenly they can regulate our credit. Every time a consumer wants to check his credit, for example, or tries to do something, you lower your credit score. There's problems like that, but that's old wine and new wineskins. The electrical grid, just by knowing what your electricity. So it's a question of ubiquity. And how do we prepare to rethink everything? Because all the old stuff is going to be in the new rather than, and we have to think about policy as a strategic issue rather than policy as a present issue. And that's a hard way it's hard to think that way, I know. But
Well, Brett, it's a great point and a great question. So I'm actually going to do kind of a shameless plug for IGF and the Internet of Things and our dynamic coalition. We've met within the Internet of Things, the Dynamic Coalition and IGF, and we met in 2008 in Hybridad. We met in Nairobi in 2013 in Bali, and then 2014 and obviously in Istanbul. So this conversation has been very helpful. But what we have to keep in mind, as we really broaden this out within IGF and think about the Internet of Things, the societal challenges, for all of the world, right? That some parts of the world want to ensure privacy. Other parts of the world are more interested in public safety, health, economic growth. Parts of the developing world are looking at big data and the Internet of Things to solve some of the world's really big problems in electricity and water and agriculture. And so the conversation that's ongoing in IGF, and we need your help. We need more conversations like this. And our conversation today has really been more about privacy and security. But as we go forward to Istanbul, privacy and security are certainly on the table, along with ethics and sort of the global conversation about how we work to establish trust. And then the other issue that we really haven't spent much time on at all that's really significant is spectrum, is how do we allocate bandwidth and then how is it used efficiently. So this is part of, this technology really does have the ability, if you think of big data and the Internet of Things together, to really, as I said, solve some of the world's big problems. But we're behind in terms of the policy discussion, and so we need to have more conversations like this among the policy community, the engineering community, and the standards community, and we're looking forward to advancing this within IGF.
Well, I think that's a great place, because I know there's a heck of a lot more even I would like to say. I'm sure there are other people on the panel, and I know there were lots of hands up, which says, David, I think we need an ISOC DC panel on Internet of Things and multi-stakeholders and all that, because there's a lot more to go. Do you want to end on time? Before I end, I do actually want to thank Jonathan Zook for helping arrange the program, and David certainly, and Allison for monitoring the room and coming up with our Twitter feed. So with that, I want to thank all of the panel and thank you for interacting. Obviously, this is a thing that could have taken and should take a whole day, not just an hour of talk, but I hope this gets the conversation started. All, thank you.